Welcome to the final day of the forum. I can't believe it's almost over, and I myself am feeling a little verklempt, as my people say. It's been such a joy to see all your faces in the flesh after so long. I'm Maggie Tarnack with the Grace Communications Foundation. I've had the pleasure of serving on this year's Forum Advisory Committee, and I'm extremely pleased to introduce this morning's plenary on corporate consolidation. SAFSF felt it critical to center this issue as its impacts have been felt strongly enough to rattle even the likes of Washington, D.C. And I know we're all eager to hear about what the impacts of consolidation have been on our food system, and also successful ways to push back. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Tracy Bruckner, a policy darling, who will be moderating this morning's esteemed panel. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks Maggie, and welcome everybody. So before we start the panel this morning, we're going to show you, we've been working on a project with support from the Vathauer Family Foundation, and we've been working with Nathan Johnson of Nathan Works to create some film explainers that will lay out our three focus areas that we've been talking about: climate change, consolidation and concentration, and access to land. So Lonnie's going to play a quick film trailer. We're really excited about this project. Nathan is here today. He's been here this whole forum taking pictures. There he is. There's Nathan. Him and his colleague Jay have been an absolute pleasure to work with, so we're excited to show this film trailer. They're incredibly proud of it, and so are we, and we're looking forward to releasing the film later this year. So take it away and show the film.
America's food is produced in a vast, destructive, and unequal system. Food still gets to our tables, but at what cost? I'm on a journey to explore three problems with agriculture in America.
Won't you come and see what it's like? Living by the rules that you write. You ain't know those lavish delights. Now you ain't no back in sight.
Number 1, concentration and consolidation.
That spark started a fire that burned for hours Friday night.
The loss of just this one facility impacted cattle markets not just in this region, but across much of the industry.
Number 2, land access.
Since 1920, it's estimated that black farmers have lost nearly 20 million acres of farmland.
Too often, farmland is out of reach for a new generation of farmers, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And finally, we'll talk about climate change. Agriculture is one of the largest contributors to climate change, but yet it's also a solution. I want to hear the perspective from the people who are burdened by these problems, and also what they think are viable solutions. I'm Masika Henson. Now let's dig in.
All right. All right, so Nathan's going to be here, and if you have questions for Nathan, he can come up and join us for Q&A, or you can catch him later as well. So thank you, Nathan. Okay, we're going to dive into our plenary now. So as we said, consolidation and concentration shows up across much of the agriculture and food system. Whether we're talking about agricultural inputs, food processing, grocery stores, or baby formula, we see consolidation and concentration have a significant impact that affects farmers, farm and food workers, communities, and the environment. So for today's discussion with our speakers, Claire with Open Markets Institute, Sarah with the Western Organization of Resource Councils, and Bill Bullard with RCAF, we're going to focus specifically on the consolidation and concentration in the livestock sector. So with that, we're going to start off here. So as each of you introduce yourselves, can you give the basic understanding of what we mean by consolidation and concentration in the livestock sector? And can you tell us what drew you and your organization to focus on the issue? So we'll go first to Claire, and then Sarah, and then we'll finish with Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, and thanks for everyone being here. My name is Claire Kellaway. I'm the food program manager at the Open Markets Institute. We study antitrust policy across the economy. I obviously focus on food and agriculture in particular. And so concentration, it's a market structure. It talks about how many entities, how many businesses control how much of an industry. And in antitrust policy, there are specific figures that we sort of measure a market by how consolidated it is, how monopolistic or oligopolistic it is, and what risks does that have of reducing fair competition, increasing market manipulation. And so in meatpacking in particular, the levels of concentration are above what's generally considered moderately or highly concentrated. So in chicken, the top 4 companies process more than half of all chicken. In pork, the top 4 companies process more than 2/3. And in beef, the top 4 companies process 85% roughly of all our meat. And so that raises a lot of risks that these companies are not going to compete as rigorously or as fairly or coordinate on their pricing and just generally have market power to corner markets, to control the farmers that they're working with. And yeah, this raises a whole bunch of issues. We've seen allegations of price fixing. We've seen these meat companies pay hundreds of millions of dollars to settle price fixing allegations. This isn't a hypothetical risk. It's something that has been evidenced and highly suggested. We also see higher barriers to entry into the industry and exclusive deals in terms of cornering access to retail markets and farmers' ability to, find places to process and then sell their foods. And also just with concentration generally, it tends to lead to higher corporate profit margins and also less profit sharing with employees or farmers. And on the whole, this, it creates a lot of inequality. It concentrates power and control and wealth over food production in a handful of very powerful corporations. This translates into political power over how these markets are regulated. And it also just prevents general market dynamism and innovation and blocks new farmers who are doing more sustainable, interesting, humane ways of raising animals from growing and accessing markets. So for all these reasons, Open Markets is interested in addressing this. And I think the other thing about this issue that really interests me is a lot of people will say this is just kind of natural market forces tending towards efficient systems, but I think it's the outcome of policy choices. And we've seen, especially in livestock, these markets have not been as concentrated as they are today. This is something that's really happened and increased dramatically since the 1980s. In some ways, before antitrust laws were passed, we saw these market structures. We saw antitrust laws were passed and enforced, and then that enforcement really decreased, and we have the market structures that we do today. So I think it's an outcome of policy choices, but because of that, I think there are opportunities to restructure these markets in different ways.
All right. Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. Am I on? I am on. Okay. I'm Sarah Kendall. I'm the interim executive director with the Western Organization of Resource Councils. We are a network of community-based organizations in the Northern Rockies and Great Plains states. I work out of our Washington, D.C. office, but our home is in Billings, Montana. And we have 8 member groups who do primarily rural community organizing. A lot of our members are family farmers and ranchers. I started with the organization as an intern when I was still in college in 1989. And at that period in time, a lot of our members were very concerned about the increasing concentration that they saw, that Claire alluded to, in the cattle sector. They had kind of seen what had happened in the chicken industry in the 50s, where over a decade, that sector went from having very few operations working under contract to having more than 90% working under contract with integrators. And so they were, and really what they saw was a loss of control and loss of profitability. So many of our members are cow-calf producers. Rhonda, I think, talked about this area where you have a lot of smaller operations that have a smaller number of cattle that they might feed themselves with grains that they're raising on their farms, their diversified farms. And what we have in our region more is larger operations that we're not raising corn and soybeans. The cows are raised on grass. And so fewer operators that are involved in the feeding sector. And so they're sort of selling off their cattle to be fed and fattened and then marketed. As a result, our part of the country is really more, it's sort of iconic ranchers who are, very independent. We don't have as much presence of large packing companies, and our region has really been the, sort of one of the kind of rallying points for producers who are just really concerned about the growing corporate consolidation. So around the time I started with the organization, we had brought in some folks from the Southeast who were poultry producers working under contract, and really learned from them about what folks have come to call the chickenization of the livestock sector. And to our members, that really, what that means is loss of autonomy, loss of control. For a producer, you need two things, maybe three if you, in our neck of the woods, moisture is always a big one that folks are really worried about, but you need a fair price and you need market access, and the two are really related to each other. And so while we've watched the numbers of the growing control by a few smaller corporations, what our folks have been really concerned about has been how do those companies exercise their market power. And what we've seen over time is limiting market access and exerting pressure on prices and controlling prices, so that the producer's share of the dollar, as concentration in the cattle sector has grown, the producer's share of the consumer dollar has really declined, so that it used to be the producers would get about 2/3 of the consumer dollar, and now that's really reversed, and it's just about 1/3. So we went during the 80s from having about 35% of the packing sector controlled by 4 corporations to, by the end of the 80s, it was about in the low 70s, mid 70s, and today it's 85%, which is one of the most concentrated. I think maybe just the last thing I would highlight is that what that has meant on the ground is that there are fewer larger packing plants. So the number of packing plants during the time where this concentration has occurred has dropped by about 80%. The number of feeders in the cattle sector has dropped by about 1/3, and the number of producers has declined about 40%. So the size of the U.S. cattle herd is decreasing. We're importing more. That's a whole other aspect of this. And the operations in all parts of all sectors of the industry have increased in size. And we can talk about some of the impacts of that. So I was away from the organization for a little while, but then started working again for our organization in DC in 1994. And by that period of time, we had really focused on what do you do about the policy that Claire alluded to. And so we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but have spent a lot of time developing policies that would address the price fixing and restore competition to the sector.
All right, thank you. Bill.
Well, good morning. RCAF USA is a national trade association, nonprofit, representing independent cattle producers. We only represent the farmers and ranchers that actually raise cattle, and I have a slide I want to show you to answer the question, why are we concerned about concentration and why should you be too? And if the slide is up, what I'm showing you is a slide starting in 1990 going through present time. It's the monthly data, 32 years of data, on the retail price of beef, that's the blue graph, and the price of cattle that cattle farmers and ranchers receive, that's the red line. It starts in 1990, but merger mania occurred in 1980. As Sarah said, in 1980, 4 packers controlled 36% of the market. And at the time, we had just nearly 1,500 federally inspected meatpacking plants scattered all across America. That was 1980. In the early 90s, where this chart starts, is when the concentration had already occurred. It just took about a decade to jump from 36% to 80%, 4 packers controlling 80% of the fed cattle market by 1994. And so concentration is when you have control in just in a few hands. Consolidation is when the product itself becomes consistent in quality, typically a lower quality, and the price continues to begins to increase. And so here we are in 1990, the beginning of this graph. You see a synchronous relationship. As retail beef prices rose, so too did cattle prices that farmers and ranchers received rise. We hit the peak up there in 2014, the end of 2014. Highest nominal prices in history for the price of cattle. And retail prices were likewise at the highest price in the history of the industry. And then suddenly the anomaly. Suddenly cattle prices fell inexplicably, but retail beef prices continued to escalate. So what had happened through this consolidation period, and what's very, very important, the important thing to know about concentration is it kills competition. And consolidation kills competition and devours the marketing infrastructure, the competitive infrastructure needed by independent producers scattered across America to get their cattle to the local auction yard and then to available feedlot for marketing and then to a packing plant. So we went from 1,500 meat packers in 1980 through merger mania. We ended up with 40% fewer. We had fewer than 900 federally inspected meat packing plants by the early 90s. Today, we've lost over 50% of those. We now have less than 700 federally inspected meat packing plants. But you see, cattle prices have fallen inexplicably, and it is forcing cattle producers out of the industry. Independent producers are exiting the industry in droves. As Sarah said, we've lost over 500,000 cattle producers just over a generation, just since 1980. So you see cattle prices falling, and you see beef prices that consumers are paying at the grocery store increasing. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an indicator of a functionally or a dysfunctional market, a broken market. And so as Sarah said, back in 1980, the producer received 63 cents of every dollar you spent on beef. And the meat packer and the retailer shared 37 cents. That was just over a generation ago. And that's the pink or the red is the packer retailer share was small, 37%. The producer's share, the live cattle supply chain, 63%. In 4 decades, completely reversed. 2021, the retailers received 63%, and the packers, 63 cents of every dollar that you spend on beef is going to the meat packer and the retailer, and only 37 cents is going to the producer. So how in the world does that happen in a competitive industry? It doesn't. Concentration and consolidation kills competition as vertical integration within the industry, turning the cattle industry into the chickenization process, into the poultry industry, is the process of eliminating competition in the industry and instead subjecting the industry to a command and control regime by 4 packers that control 85% of the market.
Thanks, Bill. Well, speaking of that and the impacts, Sarah, we've kind of touched on what the impacts are for farmers. We've lost a significant number of ranchers and farmers who were involved in the cattle markets. But tell us what those impacts are for markets, for rural communities, this consolidation and concentration. What is the impact right here in the Great Plains where we are today?
I think if you were on the site visits yesterday, I think you saw what a lot of those impacts are. You know, there's no other sector that returns money to the community the way agriculture and food systems do when they're working correctly. And so, and when they're not working correctly, what does that loss of the producer share of that dollar mean? You know, for the individual producer, it means their operations are more strained, right? They might need to produce more in order to reach a break-even point. They, hopefully, right, if they're not losing money, they're putting off buying a new pickup, they're putting off buying new equipment, and all of that puts strain on their communities. And we've seen, I think, everywhere businesses go out of business. You know, so many local towns in our region used to have car and truck dealers, implement suppliers, and you have to travel further now to get to those places because those businesses have shuttered, and towns have hollowed out, which affects the entire social infrastructure, as we know. I think the things that I just would also highlight is that it's not just those local businesses, it's that people coming, young people used to be able to raise a couple head of cattle, a few hogs. That could pay for a college education, and that is not the case anymore. It also could set up young families to start in agriculture. That was how you began, with, in 4-H with a few head of livestock, and that's just not an option for people now. I think as you think about this integrated system where we haven't talked a lot, but in the cattle sector, we have less vertical integration and ownership of livestock by the packers, but we have greater use of contracts and marketing arrangements, and those are not offered in an open and transparent way. They're offered selectively, and so if you have that kind of control over marketing, then who does that impact most? I think for folks who are concerned about racial justice and about Black farmers, for example, I mean, we've seen over decades how those constituencies have been affected by systems that are not open, that are not transparent, that are not equitable, and that is a huge part of what we're seeing in concentration right now. That the farmers who are impacted the most are smaller, they tend to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color as well, and so that's very real, that effect that we're seeing. I think the last couple things I just would mention, one is just environmental impacts and humane treatment of animals, that we've had a lot of alliances over the years working on consolidation with folks who are very concerned about those issues, because we know that those larger operations that are operating on more of a really narrow margin, that they have much greater environmental impact and also impact on how animals in the system are treated. I think maybe the one last thing to kind of talk about is just the regional infrastructure. I know a lot of all of us have put a lot of work into building those local and regional food systems, and it is very hard to operate those kinds of operations in a concentrated system the way we have. I talked earlier about market access, about getting a fair price, and if you're USDA and you're putting $500 million right now into rebuilding that supply chain and the regional processing infrastructure, those operations are operating within this system, and everyone within this system, doesn't matter if you're organic, grass-fed, local, you are affected by the prices that producers are being paid everywhere. Like, your price is always relative to what those market prices are, and so our members have been involved in establishing countless alternative processing, alternative marketing initiatives over the years, and it's extremely hard to succeed with this sort of concentration in the marketplace. And so I think we're very concerned right now that the investment that's being made it could be very, very hard to sustain. I mean, it's an exciting opportunity that we're in, but it makes it all the more important to be looking at the underlying system and the policies that are in place.
All right, thank you. Okay, Claire, we're going to turn back to you now. In your role as a journalist, how do you communicate about this issue, and also how do you see mainstream media talking about this issue?
Yeah, once there's kind of a joke we have in our office, like once you sort of learn about how market structures have changed over time, you just sort of start seeing monopolies everywhere. It's like definitely a strong frame I take to my journalism, and anytime I see an issue pop up in the news or in the mainstream media, my first question is always, well, how concentrated is this industry, and how do sort of corporate domination and market power dynamics play in? And very often I think there's a thread to be brought out there that I think until quite recently with the pandemic really wasn't covered in a lot of media coverage. I mean, it's in some ways business journalism. It's really understanding these markets and how they work, and understanding supply chains and the small businesses, or business sectors rather, that don't get as much focus. Like, we think about the chicken industry, but what about the people who are providing building materials for chicken houses, or the loan infrastructure, how are these systems concentrated too, and how does that affect farmers' choices? How does that affect prices? And yeah, I think it's a huge underlying factor in a lot of issues in the food system. And I think the pandemic really did, show the inherent risks of these market structures, and I think spur on a lot of education about, oh wow, there are a huge loss of processing plants. Like, just one plant processes a fifth of all our pork or all our beef. This information can be hard to access. It can seem dry, I guess, but it's really a question of power and control and agency in these really important systems that feed us. So I'm glad to see the coverage getting more analysis, but I think there's so many different ways that this can be uncovered and analyzed. So I really always try to bring that lens to my reporting, and also bring the historic lens. Again, really remind readers that this is the way it is now, but this isn't necessarily the way it always was, which I think is also helpful for people to understand how the market has changed and concentrated over time.
All right. So Bill, the current administration's been very vocal about these issues, and they seem determined to address them. And can you help us understand what some of those opportunities are before us right now, and how we actually capitalize on those?
Sure. So the administration has allocated over $1 billion now to help to expand packer capacity. Remember, in over a generation, we've lost over half of the meat packers that were in existence back in the 80s and were in your local and regional areas. So now what the USDA wants to do, and its primary emphasis, is to build more capacity, to restore what was lost in the 80s. But until and unless they address the abuse of market power emanating from the highly concentrated meat packers, those new packing plants, as Sarah indicated, could be being set up for failure or for acquisition by the largest meat packers. And their greatest challenge is going to be access to the output market, to a retailer, because many of these large packers have long-term contracts with the meat packers, and they're exclusive contracts. They are also producers of multiple species. In other words, they're offering pork, chicken, turkey, fish, and beef. And if a beef producer wants to enter that market, they're going to be challenged by the inability to address the other protein needs of a retailer. So you've got antitrust issues that need to be addressed. And 4 decades ago, the regulators in the United States had fallen under the spell of a theory that said largest of scale created efficiencies, and that trumps competition. And so for 40 years, we've ignored our antitrust laws. They've collected dust: our Packers and Stockyards Act, Commodity Exchange Act, Clayton Act, Sherman Act, all of which have been ignored in the livestock sector. Now there's a reintroduction or a renewed interest by the administration in those. So the USDA is currently in the process of promulgating rules with which to implement a Packers and Stockyards Act that was passed by Congress 100 years ago to protect independent cattle producers from abusive marketing power by the concentrated meat packers, from being treated unfairly, from being deceived, from being treated, being discriminated against, and instances where the meat packers were offering exclusive sweetheart-type deals, preferences, to some of the largest cattle feeders and depriving all the others. Sarah described the loss of cattle feeders in the United States. Those are extremely important to independent cattle producers, cow-calf producers, because they're the marketing outlets. And so as you see a loss in cattle feedlots, you're losing your competitive infrastructure. You're losing marketing opportunities for independent producers. And we've lost 75% of them in just 25 years. There's only 25,000 independent farmer feeders left in the United States that are relatively small feedlots that have a capacity. Somebody tell me my time, I'm lost here.
You're good. You're good.
Okay.
We got. Yeah, you're okay. We've
So,
got
so
like 10 minutes left.
we've lost the feedlots, the marketing outlets for cow-calf producers. The administration is now working to promulgate rules to create fairness in the marketplace. But that's not enough, and that's why our organization back in 2019 filed an historic antitrust class action lawsuit against the Big Four packers, alleging that they have conspired to artificially depress prices paid to independent cattle producers while simultaneously inflating prices to consumers. We allege in our lawsuit that they did it by manipulating the marketplace. We allege that what they did was they ensured that they periodically reduced slaughter capacity in order to ensure there was never any more demand for cattle than the available supply. And we allege that once they periodically reduced slaughter capacity, then they agreed to purchase fewer cattle in the competitive marketplace and to instead purchase cattle, where Sarah indicated, through contracts, through formula contracts that are on their face anti-competitive, because these forward contracts, also known as formula contracts, allow the packers to shift cattle out of the competitive cash market and into a contract where a price isn't even determined until the cattle are delivered several months later. And when they are delivered, the price is ultimately tied to this ultra-thin cash market that the cattle have been removed from, and the meat packers can manipulate that market simply by avoiding it. You have 4 packers controlling 85% of the market. If only 2 of them show up one day to bid on cattle, you will be assured of lower prices for cattle. I'm sure I'm over time now.
You're good. We got 10 minutes left before we turn it to Q&A. So, okay, turning back to Sarah. So there's been I think this is a really important question, and you kind of touched on it in your earlier comments, but I think we need to keep with our theme of the film of digging deep. I think we need to dig a little deeper here. There's been a lot of focus on creating alternative markets, and the administration is investing in that too, as a way to preserve the independent livestock producer, which is great. But why is it important that we fix this problem of the overall market and not just focus on creating alternatives?
The situation that we're in right now didn't just arise spontaneously out of nowhere. There's a reason why it exists, and we've talked about the policies and the enforcement actions that kind of are really shaping it. And so there were intentional decisions that were made at different points in time that have really gotten us to where we're at now. And if we don't address those, then they're going to continue to kind of reinforce the system that we have. And that's also true even if you get into organics, if you get into grass-fed, that is, those these contracts exist there as well. There's nothing about those systems that is immune from the kinds of market pressures that we're seeing happening in the mainstream cattle markets and livestock markets. And so I think that we need to it's great to have the investment that we're having right now in the supply chain and in the processing infrastructure, but those systems, like the producers still need to have an access to a fair price, which you get through bidding in an open and competitive market. They still need to have access to that market. And if you're limiting that through who is allowed to have access to a contract, then you're still going to be just replicating the same problems that we have. And so we think it's just imperative, and there are a number of ways that we can get to it, through legal action, through administrative action, through legislative action, but we have to address those underlying challenges.
All right, thanks. Okay, we're going to turn back to all our speakers now and bring this home for philanthropy. So what do you think is the role of philanthropy in maximizing these opportunities? In addition to funding advocacy around the issues, how can philanthropy use their influence as well?
I can start?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
We'll start with Claire and then go on down the line.
Very logical assumption. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's, as kind of we've discussed, there's a critical window of opportunity for policy work in this area with the interest from USDA in doing packed and stockyards rulemakings and signals from the Biden administration to increase antitrust enforcement, change things like the merger rules. So if we want to prevent, these new plants from being acquired by industry, we need to change the sort of assessment or the signals that we give to businesses of how we're going to allow mergers or not. The DOJ has authority to prevent mergers, to block them, say this is going to create too much concentration, this is going to create a market that has too much risk of market manipulation, price fixing, also of like suppressing wages for workers, which is something we haven't talked about, which is another huge issue with these monopolistic markets. So yeah, there are authorities in the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission to set what are called fair competition rules. They have what's called unfair methods of competition rulemaking authority, things like these exclusive deals that big retailers enter into with meat processors past a certain point, are violations of antitrust law. They're really hard to enforce, but there are ways we can increase that enforcement through rulemaking. So point being, huge window of opportunity for political action that I feel like we really haven't seen. The pandemic has really spurred interest in this. And so I think there's many different ways that philanthropy can plug into that. I mean, you mentioned advocacy. I think also the narrative work, I'm partial to that as through my reporting, but I do think we've seen the power that things like, the great reporting that Politico did around the baby formula crisis. That was really journalism, I think, that uncovered a lot of that critical information and really elevated the lived experiences and super real needs of people that actually had been going uncovered. This issue has been going on for months, and it wasn't really until there was this media focus that all of a sudden it received the urgency it needs. So narrative work showing how these market structures really tie into all these really important questions of inequality and choice and innovation in the market. Those would be the two I would think of, but see what everyone else has to say.
Sarah.
I've worked in DC now for nearly 30 years, and I think there's a growing understanding of the importance of philanthropy amongst our, federal policymakers and what it means to have philanthropy invested in a major initiative. And I think we've definitely we've been through sort of a couple of cycles of, serious efforts to try to win policy changes on these issues, some of which have been successful and some not. And I think what I've seen working on these consolidation and fair markets issues is that it's a fairly small community of people who are working really hard, and that to have the kind of impact that we need to have in this moment of opportunity, it's just going to be, critical to have a deeper investment. Like I've been in meetings with congressional staff, with administration officials on different issues where they've sort of asked where philanthropy is. And so I think that it's increasingly well understood what kind of impact you all can have. And it's not, I think for us, it starts with base building and grassroots producers and also consumers. Like, we need to have, even if you don't fund policy directly, the impact of having a really engaged and educated base of grassroots folks is really critical on an issue like this. One of the things that we are fighting against is this perception that agriculture, policymakers are always confused because agriculture seems so divided, and we have groups that we see as really highly influenced by the largest companies, including the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the National Pork Producers Association, and I think it can be confusing for policymakers to say, like, these are groups that tout themselves as supporting family farm agriculture, and yet they're opposing the policies that we are promoting. And so it's really critical that we have a base of producers that are very vocally advocating and engaged with their members of Congress and with the administration. And I think similarly on the narrative point, we've seen the power of communications over many years. I've had a couple times in my career where we know, like, the president has seen a front page article on the New York Times, and I think having that kind of communication out there and coverage of these issues is really critical. And so I know there are folks in the room who are really focused on communications, and that's extremely important as well. So I think no matter what your sort of strategy and kind of funding area is or approach, like the legal strategies which Bill mentioned, attention to. We're gonna need it all to have progress, to make progress in this area.
All right, Bill.
So the family farm system of agriculture was the envy of the world in terms of producing an efficient, affordable, and abundant supply of food for America and for the world over. And about 40 years ago, the meat packers went to Congress and the administration, the executive branch, and convinced them that they're bigger and they could do it better. And Congress and the executive branch fell into hook, line, and sinker and agreed. And so that's when this efficiency overcame competition. It was believed that the consumer welfare benefit, if we could produce more food at a cheaper price for consumers, that was good for America, and we let the farmers and ranchers fall by the wayside. And while that occurred, the meat packers were very strategic. They went in and they infiltrated all the conventional organizations that represented producers, like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, like the Pork Producers Council, like the Chicken Council. They seated meat packers on the governing boards of these organizations that purported to represent producers. And suddenly they convinced Congress that what was good for the integrator and for the packer was ultimately good for the producer, because they were all in this together. And we bought into that. And they built an entire institution to support exactly what we have today, to support concentration, consolidation, and the death of competition in the industry. And so to overcome that, we need philanthropy, because there's too few of us left. Our organization has 5,000 independent cattle producer members in 44 states, and we're funded entirely by membership dues, $50 a year for a one-year membership to our organization. And we don't have the resources to do what needs to be done. But in addition to, but part of this institution, they built a castle, and in that castle, they've got land-grant university economists that have been supporting this efficiency ideal for decades. And they've convinced Congress for decades. And Congress, the majority of Congress still believes that the efficiency model is better than the competitive model that we once had and that many of us want to migrate back towards. And so to overcome that, we're going to have to fight the economists at their levels. We've got organizations like the American Farm Bureau Federation that has its own economics division. And anytime a policy initiative is introduced in Washington, they'll develop a policy economic paper, and they'll convince many members of Congress that that is the wrong approach because it will somehow interfere with efficiency. We need an independent economic body that can look at the issues from the position of American citizens and independent farmers and ranchers. We don't have that now. But very recently, this is a new emergence has occurred since the first of the year. We've now had 5 reports and economic studies coming from independent economists that are confronting and fighting against the institution that has been supporting and furthering the destruction of competition within the industry and the demise of the independent family farm and ranch system of agriculture in the United States. So philanthropy really does need to work on the academic side. They need to ensure that we do have some counterbalance to the institution that is deeply ingrained in the industry that is supporting the meat packers' efforts to continue and further consolidation, and will make it extremely difficult for all of your regional and local new initiatives in building packing plants and slaughtering plants. And so the economic side, to be able to argue on an expert level and to provide Congress with the tools that they need to confront this impenetrable barrier is absolutely essential. And in our case, philanthropy is why we're able to engage in the third branch of government, the judicial system. If it were not for philanthropy, we would not be managing 5 lawsuits right now. One dealing with the government's forceful requirement that all cattle producers use the most expensive animal identification means necessary, an RFID ear tag. We've litigated that through a foundation, through the attorneys. We've got 2 checkoff lawsuits arguing that the beef checkoff program that requires cattle producers to contribute $1 per head for every animal sold, and then the money is used to further corporate concentration and to further the self-interest of corporations. We have 2 lawsuits pending in that arena, and that's because of philanthropy. It's a foundation that's representing us. Now, our antitrust case is a private issue, but we need more antitrust cases filed in the United States. And what Claire said was extremely important. We have to have awareness of the public because ultimately this is hurting the public. The public is currently paying, and has been paying for 8 years, super inflated prices for beef. And at the same time, the cattle producers are being driven out of business because they're struggling just to recover their cost of production. Many of them cannot. We don't know the number of cattle producers we've lost just in the past few years because the U.S. Department of Agriculture quit taking annual data on that subject. Now we have to wait for the census every 5 years, and we're afraid that, like the feedlot sector that we know have been dropping like flies, we think our independent producers have been dropping like flies too, and we're soon to find that out in the next census.
All right. Thank you. I think we're going to open it up to Q&A now. We have Susie with a microphone. Do we have some questions? And Renee with a microphone.
I think I'm the first. I had a question on the packing plants, if there was any space that you're aware of for shareholder activism to try to drive less competitive or less anti-competitive practices, or if they're all privately run. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's like there are some of these packers that are investor owned. There are some key ones though, like Cargill, that's privately owned, and then we also have many that are foreign owned. I guess I don't know the degree to which there's room for shareholder activism in these companies like JBS, which is the world's largest meat packer, and Smithfield, which are both foreign owned. I mean, I guess presumably they have some investors from around the world. But point being, that is the market structure, though. I guess I don't know if that would be my preferred strategy, but I haven't thought about it much, frankly, so I'm curious what you all think. Yeah.
So that's been tried. In fact, that's why over a century ago, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then 1914 or 12, the Clayton Act. It's because self-governance, self-discipline on the part of corporations whose primary objective is to increase profits doesn't work. And that's why we need the regulators to regulate. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened for 40 years. So the real solution is that we have to enforce the current antitrust laws. And then, as Claire indicated, we've got outdated and antiquated guidelines that the U.S. Department of Justice has been following. And fortunately, the Federal Trade Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice are in the process of revising those guidelines to determine new standards. So when has horizontal integration gone too far, and when has vertical integration gone too far? And those are the key questions, because for decades, economists have been focused on monopolies, which primarily affects consumers, but they've completely ignored the monopsony power of the concentrated packers and their ability to control the supply chain, the input side of their businesses. And so the updating of these merger guidelines and the enforcement of antitrust laws is critically important to reversing. And very importantly, we can't make incremental changes. Our cattle industry is the largest sector of American agriculture. It generates about $67 billion a year all across the United States. There's about 750,000 cattle producers left. But we're soon to lose the infrastructure necessary to sustain a competitive industry. And once that's gone, it's game over. And all you have to do is ask the poultry producers and the hog producers about that. They've lost their critical infrastructure. They've lost their ability to access a market on a timely basis and in a locality that they can access. And as a result, the industry is now controlled by the meatpacking industry. And so the shareholder activism, I think, plays a role, but I do not believe that it's a critical component of the solution to this problem.
Renee, you have a question over there? Yep.
Hi, I'm Johnella Holmes from the Kansas Black Farmers Association out of Kansas. And we have 3 ranchers that we've been trying to work with, looking at the farmer co-op model and trying to encourage them to look at a rancher co-op model. We also worked with the first, let me say thank you to Stray Dog for sponsoring me here, because this workshop has been and conference has been just phenomenal. Okay, so that commercial is over. I've been working with those 3 small ranchers, and we also worked with Farm Family Action to do legislative flyovers and bring that issue to the forefront, and those other things. What can I do to help those ranchers? What model can we use? What organization can we join? What can we do to help those small ranchers?
Sure.
I don't know that there's a magic answer, and I think a lot of, like, if I were here in Missouri, I would for sure connect up with Missouri Rural Crisis Center. We work really closely with them. I think, depending on who those ranchers are, it's hard. We have members who do direct marketing and have had some success with that. Like, so much depends on what's their size, what's their specific situation, what options are available to them. I think it's, there's a lot to be said from the producer's perspective about being involved in a local food system and direct marketing. That's really, it can be a really good model, but I don't know enough about like what's happening locally, for them to tap into. I don't know, Bill, what else would you say?
Yeah, that's the $60 million question.
Yeah.
So I agree that there is no silver bullet, but I also believe that if everyone is pulling in the same direction, then everything matters with respect to what everyone is doing individually. But importantly, when there's congressional legislation that's being considered, we need calls into members of Congress. And if they do not receive calls in opposition to the institution that's been built to continue the status quo, they will maintain the status quo. And so we need more activism and calls to Congress and education of Congress. Same with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. When a rulemaking is offered as a proposed rule, we need the public to comment, and we need many more to comment than what has been commenting in the past. Right now, there's proposed rules on transforming the poultry market structure, and there will soon be rules released this summer on implementing the Packers Stockyards Act. And so those are critically important to the industry. And very importantly, as Sarah indicated, find an organization that you believe is representing the interests of you and the people you represent, and support it. And disavow those organizations that do not. That's one of the problems that we have, is ranchers continue to support organizations that are working against their economic and financial interests. And it's just, it's mind-boggling, but it occurs on a regular basis.
And I guess I would follow up on the cooperatives point. This is, I guess, pretty broad, but historically cooperatives have been a really important part of the anti-monopoly movement. They've been a way for farmers to come together and build power against concentrated forces. And so I think this is a really promising economic model that we've seen play an effective role for farmers and ranchers in the past, and just food businesses generally. I think, having a democratic, it's a matter of economic democracy. It's a democratically run business as opposed to one that's driven by the short-term profit interests of investors. But of course, cooperatives exist within this concentrated market system too. And so that's just another reason why we need to have more fair competition rules, so these alternative business models have a chance at succeeding and growing. We also have an issue where, absent antitrust enforcement, some cooperatives have become monopolistic in and of themselves. They're not necessarily a silver bullet system. We see some really massive agribusinesses that are even suppressing, the prices paid to their own members. I think about cooperatives like Dairy Farmers of America. It's the biggest processor of milk in the country, and they've gotten so large then so kind of distanced from the democratic processes that they're making decisions that arguably are against their members' interests. So this is another reason why, we just have to be kind of vigilant of excessive market concentration and market power across the industry, across different types of business sectors. And I think there could be a lot more resources put into what is democratic cooperative governance, and also, capital access for cooperatives is a huge issue. There's just a lot of reasons why they're not on a level playing field with other businesses. So I think that's an important part of the competitive landscape of sort of counteracting issues of market power that definitely needs a lot more attention.
Good morning. Pete Huff with the Wallace Center, and first of all, I want to say thank you for the presentation and your leadership and work on this. I feel like it's a tough thing to unpack with folks, but it's a really critical one. I thought you all did a really great job, so thank you. Given the influence that you all have mentioned around the packers and multinational organizations or businesses, as well as the growth in imports, can you speak about the relationship between this issue and trade agreements and the Federal Trade Commission, and how organizations or philanthropy can kind of break into that black box of trade agreements and negotiations that ultimately do tie up some of the options for making progress?
Go for it, Bill.
Okay. So yes. So concentration began in the early 80s, the merger mania period, the decade of the 80s. But soon after that, we entered the phase of globalization. That began in 1994 when we entered the North American Free Trade Agreement. When that agreement was entered, it was promised to producers that we would restore prosperity for livestock producers because we would create more access abroad and greater demand for their product. And since 1994, all we've seen is the further elimination of cattle producers, the continued decline in our cattle numbers, and the continued economic cost price squeeze that cattle producers are receiving. In other words, the trade agreements have not benefited the independent producers of livestock. Instead, they've benefited the globalized multinational corporations that have been fueling this. So globalization combined with concentration has provided the concentrated meat packers with the leverage to reduce demand for the product produced by American producers. And that's occurring right now under NAFTA. The trade imbalance between the United States and NAFTA or Canada and Mexico is horrendous. We're importing about 3 times the volume of beef that we export to those 2 countries, and in terms of value, it's double. We import twice as much on a value basis than we are exporting. On a worldwide basis, we are a net importer of beef on a volume basis. The trade agreements that have promised prosperity for the independent producers have instead provided the multinational meat packers with the leverage to exercise, to implement their abusive market power that they inherently possess because of their dominant market position. In other words, you can have a concentrated marketplace and you can have four meat packers actually competing in the market. But that's not necessarily the case, and it takes time for them to perfect their ability to exercise or to implement and deploy the instruments needed to affect the market power that they have. And that's the forward contracts that we talked about earlier, and it's the trade policies that give them the instruments with which to exercise their inherent market power that they possess because of their dominant position. And what's happening is we are exploiting producers on one end of the supply chain, consumers on the other, and that has to change. And philanthropy needs to help, and the economic studies need to be focused on the adverse effects of imports on independent cattle producers and other livestock producers in the United States. I think that's critically important.
I'd just add 2 things quickly. One is that, just to give you a couple of examples of how this works, in 2003 in Canada there was an outbreak of BSE, mad cow disease, and the border was closed. We weren't importing cattle from Canada. When those cattle come in, those are all coming in. They're contract cattle that are controlled by the packers at that point in time. And during that period of time, when the border was closed, that was a period of time when packers had to buy more cattle on the open market here, and we had better prices to producers. Those contract cattle, they're bad for producers in Canada, they're bad for producers in the US. Those flows of cattle are used to exert price pressure in the market. And the other example is There was a period of time when we passed through Congress mandatory labeling of country of origin of cattle, whether they're born, raised, and hogs, born, raised, and processed in the U.S. And when we had a period of time when that was in place, also consumers want to buy U.S. beef, U.S. pork, and it was challenged under our trade laws and ultimately sunsetted by Congress because we didn't follow up and kind of challenge that and negotiate it out. But while country of origin labeling was in place, that was another period of time when demand was high and prices to producers were better. So it kind of shows you the intersection between trade policy and the very real outcomes to producers. So
I think Bill wants to point to this slide real quick, but then we'll have to wrap up. So if you still have questions, please catch our speakers following this.
So very quickly, what Sarah just said, if you see right above me this spike in the red line, that's fed cattle prices. Back in 2004 and 5, fed cattle prices rose then to the highest nominal prices in history. For the first time, fed cattle prices broke $100 a hundredweight. And that was precisely the reason that Sarah described, is we cut off a relatively small volume of live cattle imports from Canada for 2 years as a result of the mad cow disease, the BSE issue. But what that demonstrated to us was how those imported cattle provided such significant leverage to the meat packers to keep prices down, because when the meat packers could no longer access those cattle, it unleashed the competitive forces in the marketplace, and suddenly cattle prices became competitive for a brief moment in history.
Well, I want to thank our speakers. This was a fun and interesting plenary. Thank you so much.